Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study. We're plain and simple, book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Currently, we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Now, this chapter, I'm kind of taking a little time because um, one of the most interesting thing about Ecclesiastes, of course, is the philosophical kind of aspect that Solomon is given. In other words, he's asking philosophical questions. And so in this chapter, he's talking about that what was the, what did he gain by all of the pleasure that he had access to? Now, let's be clear that not all of us have that. In our day, we think about certain celebrities. You think about famous celebrities, rich people that have everything kind of given to them, right? Um, think about musicians, what's called groupies. I say that because as a sinful man, we all can lust after that, thinking, man, if I just had all what they had, but they do have it, and yet for some reason they always kind of will circle back around. They want one person. They want to settle down with one person. Most people, I should say, not all, but most people. In this chapter 2 here, where he talks about, and this is kind of a lengthy chapter where he really kind of goes into all of the stuff as a wealthy person that he had access to. As I said, if he didn't have it, hey, he could build it. He had the resources, the money to build it. But then he said, and then it just, what was the end of it? So, and then he says, I did all of this still while having my wisdom. So in other words, so what did the wisdom profit me, right? So let's get back and let's get into it. Um, all right, so I'll start back at verse 1 and then I'm going to go through. I did contrast this chapter with 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And the reason why I wanted to do that is to say, for us as Christians, we do have an end. There's a solid godly answer to the questions that Solomon asked. So verse 2 says, I said to myself, go ahead, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy what is good. But it turned out to be futile. Well, the reason why I contrast 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is that what you do in love won't be futile. That's the difference. Verse 2, I said about laughter, it is madness, and about pleasure, what does this accomplish? I explore with my mind how to let my body enjoy life with wine and how to grasp folly. My mind still guiding me with wisdom until I can see what is good for people to do under heaven during the few days of their life. Now that's it. I contrast 1 Corinthians chapter 13 as the answer. What you do for Christ in love will last, will be fulfilling, will have peace. One of the most amazing things is how people came to Christ during, let's say, the end of the first century, the second century, the third century, how they came to Christ were martyrs with joy and peace. Okay? All right. That's the difference. Verse 4. I increased my achievements. I built houses and planted vineyards. Watch this. For myself. So this is the whole thing is one big selfish uh, 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 goal for himself. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself and planted every kind of fruit trees in them. In other words, if I did all these things, I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be fulfilled. I constructed reservoirs of water for myself, right, from which to irrigate a grove of flourishing trees. Now you think about it, all of the wealth he had, all of the wisdom he had. He can kind of design these structures. He can design. Like if you go back and you read when Solomon built the temple, and he also built a palace for himself. When people would come in this palace, they were floored. You read about when the Queen of Sheba came in, she was floored. She looked at the all of the building, the gold. She looked at his servants, how they were dressed, how they attended stuff, you know. She was floored. Verse 7, I acquired male and female servants and had slaves who were born in my house. Now what is interesting, remember, the slaves did not have this perspective of life from him. He said, I also own many herds of cattle and flock, more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. I also amassed silver and gold for myself, and the treasures of the kings of the province. I gathered male and female singers for myself, and made and many concubines, the delight of men. Now remember, the average person don't have that. It doesn't mean that there's certain men that's not out there that's being whoremongers. Notice he had a thousand wives. That's not to say he only slept with 1,000 wives. He just had 1,000 wives, which I think was 700 wives and 300 concubines. Okay, that's not to say he only slept with them, but notice he said I had masters. Notice he said gold. Gold was silver. Silver was so popular. Silver was treated like how we treat pennies, just piles of it. But he had gold, right? Verse 9, so I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also remained with me. I think that was probably part of the torment too. Well, on the other hand, he's like me. I could think, man, if I just had that, and I can get all the women, all the wealth, I could have yachts and boats and all that. Well, he had all of that, plus he also had the wisdom. Right? And it was like, I'm not fulfilled. Okay. Verse 10, all that my eyes desired, I did not deny them. I did not refuse myself any pleasure, for I took pleasure in all my struggles. This was my reward for all my struggles. I want you to notice something here. I did not, or he did not refuse himself any pleasures. Now, this is coming from a man who was the wisest man, who also was the wealthiest man. He was a popular king at the time. He was a handsome man. In other words, getting women and all this kind of stuff, all of the pleasures that he thought would satisfy him or even gratify him. He said, I did all of this to gratify myself. Verse 11, when I considered all that I have accomplished and what I've labored to achieve, I found everything to be futile and a pursuit of the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. Now, this is coming from a man, again, who was the wisest man. God made him the wisest man. And because of his wisdom, he had wealth beyond measure. People brought him gold from all over the world. They came and had an audience with him. He had women, food, fine food from all over the world. People came, they cooked the dish up for him from all over the world. And notice what he says. It's empty. Verse 12. Then I turned to consider wisdom. Now, the first thing was pleasure, right? Pleasure. I tried the pleasure thing. Then he says, then I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man be like who comes after the king? Now that's interesting because his son was a stone fool. His son was the reason the kingdom divided, right? Rehoboam, that's the reason why his son. So he says, oh, for what would a man be like who comes after the king? he will do what has already been done. And I realize that this is that, and he says, and I realize that there is an advantage to wisdom over folly, like an advantage of light over darkness. The wise man has eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I also knew that one fate comes to them both, right? Death. Or, yes, death. Verse 15. So I said to myself, what happens to the fool will also happens to me. Why then have I been overly wise? And I said to myself that this is also futile. For just like the fool, there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man, since the days to come both will be forgotten. How is how is it that the wise man died just like the fool? You always say death is the equalizer. Therefore I hated life because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. For everything is futile, and a pursuit of the wind. This is astounding coming from the wisest man on the earth. You kind of realize this, man. Why am I doing all this, right? Why am I doing all this? Verse 18. I hated all my work that I labored at under the sun, because I must leave it to a man that comes after me, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool, yet he will take over all my work that I labor at skillfully under the sun. This too is fruitful. Now, we have the benefit of knowing what this will be. We have, we already know that your son is going to be a fool. We have it on record. But his point is that I'm doing all of this work, all of this labor. Now what? Now, as I said before, let me come down from the high and lofty. I've seen this just from people, for example, just an example, people who retire, who have worked at a place, I could say 20, 30 years. And it's kind of interesting that the last day of their retirement, they're kind of like, what am I going to do? I've seen them try to do things. It's like, dude, just retire right off in the sunset. Your labor is over. But the labor is meaningless because, when you're gone, you'll be gone. And remember, he says, and no one will remember you. And that is true. Other than, think about it, if we didn't have the Bible, Solomon wouldn't be remembered. In the secular world, they don't remember him now anyway, or barely acknowledge him. All right, verse 20. So I began to give myself over to despair concerning all the work that I have labored under the sun. When there is a man whose work was done with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, he must give his portion to a man who has not worked for it. This too is futile and a great wrong. Now, there's a lot of ways we could probably look at this. That is certainly true. His son was given, just like Solomon, was given the kingdom of David, but God advanced him by giving him wisdom. That did not happen with Rehoboam, his son. The opposite of that, he destroyed the wisdom. And then the kings that were to follow were even worse, to the point that when Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed Jerusalem, he destroyed everything that Solomon had made, all the temple. Verse 23, for all of his days are filled with grief, and his occupation is sorrowful. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is futile. He says, so there is nothing better for a man to do than to eat, drink, and enjoy his work. I have seen that even this is from God's hands. Because who can eat and who can enjoy life apart from him? And right here, here it is, right? Right here, yes, Solomon, you are absolutely right. who can eat apart from this, from God? So at least after all of this is, of course, the conclusion he should have come to. Verse 26, for to man who is pleasing in his sight, he gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and accumulating in order to give to the one who is pleasing in God's sight. This too is futile in the pursuit of wind. So, you know, the good thing is that he at least came to this conclusion. How many of us, in some respects, would never, ever, ever come to this conclusion here? You know, who is pleasing in his sight? Now, again, this is an amazing chapter because if I was to have to say who would I look, I mean, when I think about the rich, and again, I'll say this again, I will say this, I would much rather be rich than to be poor. I would much rather to be empty rich and to be poor rather than to be poor and empty. And one of the things we're going to see is because both, without God, both have the same outcome. And this is what Solomon is kind of realizing here, right? I can have all the wisdom in the world, and it doesn't matter because we suffer the same fate. One just suffering luxury. And isn't it interesting? Solomon is not necessarily going to deal with, the plight of the poor. Right? You can say, well, man, look at the poor, how the poor can say, hard knock life, right? And yet, what we always kind of don't take into consideration is that, well, the rich, from that perspective, same thing. It's just they have more, the poor has none, right? So, are the poor disenfranchised? Are the poor mistreated? Absolutely. But when it comes to the same outcome, it's both the same. And guess what? You can't cheat death. You can't even cheat aging to death, no matter how much you like. The rich can spend all the money, right, on the anti-aging effect. It's not going to work. So in other words, the rich just have more money to hide a lot of their sorrow, but nevertheless they have their sorrow. When you think now keep this in mind. Solomon is not dealing with the spiritual aspect per se. He just mentioned the only way true happiness, can come is through God. But he doesn't explore the idea that the sinful nature of man is problematic. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you in the next study.